В бюрото на Константин Вълков. Добър ден. Китай произвежда най-малко 70% от световните дронове, електрическите превозни средства, литиево-ионните батерии и соларните клетки. Страната внедрява повече индустриални роботи от останалата част от света, взети заедно. Представете си. В медицината е изпреварила САЩ по брой регистрирани клинични изпитания. Идва ли нов световен ред, ако вярваме, че технологиите, а не военната сила ще побеждават от тук насетне? Много се радвам, че в бюрото на Константин Вълков наш гост е госпожа Дай Цинли, посланик на Китай в България. Добър ден!
Добър ден!
Здравейте! Ваше превъзходителство, живеем във време, в което геополитиката се променя, светът вече не е същия, а технологичните иновации ни карат да живеем нов и забързан свят. Наскоро четох книга, която описва Китай като инженерна държава, в която висшите ешелони на властта традиционно са доминирани от хора-инженери с инженерно образование. Доколко тази характеристика е вярна днес, Ваше превъзходителство?
Thank you very much, Mr. Volkov, for having me on your show. It's my real pleasure. And thank you for your description of the achievements of China in the past few decades, and especially during President Xi's time. And as you rightly said, China has become a very strong manufacturing country in the world. And in fact, for all the foreign visitors who go to China for the first time, the first thing they marvel at is the tremendous infrastructure that they see. Brand new high rises, running high-speed trains, subways, and very clean neighborhoods, and etc. And also when they go to factories, they notice very few workers nowadays in big factories. And the cars, for example, can be assembled in 1 minute. One car assembled in 1 minute by the robotic arms. So, so people marvel how China could have done that. There are many factors. And in fact, we have to see China's development as comprehensive development, not just in manufacturing, not just in technology. This development also includes education. It includes medical care. Now, even for a rural villager, like an elderly citizen in a rural village in a faraway mountain area, he or she can get hundreds of yuan of subsidies every month from the government. So we have put in place a wonderful educational, medical, healthcare system for the entire population. So that is a tremendous achievement. And not to say that we lifted around 900 million people out of poverty, out of abject poverty over the past 4 decades. So all these make up the true story of what we call Chinese path to modernization. Because I think the so-called engineering state captures the surface of things, but we have to dig deeper. If you look at China's development, you need to understand China's 5-year plans, for example. Yeah, because of the 5-year plan, China could plan this infrastructure and manufacturing development as well as educational, cultural, etc. And also, you look at the leadership of the Communist Party. It's very strong leadership, keeps policies consistent and keeps the nation very stable. So going forward, I think China will continue to score even greater achievements in technology and in lifting the living standards of our people. But that's not necessarily to compete with anyone or to, dominate anyone.
Като говорите за доминиране и за технологии, вярва ли Пекин, че именно този индустриален реализъм и способността толкова бързо, казахте за 1 минута, да се превръщат идеите в физически продукти, е решителното предимство на Китай днес, а не военната сила?
Oh, well, actually, we don't see the world like this. For China, we don't see us competing geostrategically or geopolitically with anyone. Yeah.
But the other one sees you
Yes.
like this.
That's the problem. That's the perceptional problem we have to face. Every time we deal with Western countries, they always think that because China is getting stronger, China will try to dominate the world and replace the U.S. In global dominance. But actually, it's their mentality. For our mentality, what keeps Chinese leaders awake is not how to become the next superpower, but how to deliver a better living standards for the 1.4 billion people in China. That is the reality we have to face. Because, for China, we have been poor, backward for so long. If you remember, China only started its economic takeoff since 1979, when Deng Xiaoping introduced reforms and the opening up of China. So really for us, the key priority is not, to compete and not to engage. You see, China never engages in any warfare since 1979. Yeah, no wars, no conflict, because we are overwhelmingly focused on internal development, on promoting high quality development of our economy. This is mainly to benefit the Chinese people. Of course, at the same time, maintaining a high level of military power is very important because of China's unique geopolitical situation. We have 14 land neighbors, and we have 8 countries facing China across the sea. We are in a very complicated neighborhood, and China is a strong country. And of course, we need to safeguard our national sovereignty and territorial integrity, but not in any aggressive, assertive way, but rather to ensure our national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Yeah.
Много анализатори в редица книги подсказват, че САЩ, например, трябва да действа като вас, за да възвърне инженерния си дух, а Китай пък да възприеме политическите реформи, които са приложими в Щатите, за да могат и двете общества да просперират занапред. Смятате ли, че китайското ръководство вижда политическите реформи в западния им смисъл като съвместими с сегашния план на действие, с вашия инженерен модел на управление, или ги разглежда като взаимно изключващи се?
Actually, in terms of the political system of different countries, if you look at the world, for us, we do not accept that, the Western system is the best, is universally applicable, and every country should adopt this Western system. We just don't feel that way, because if you look at the world, if you look at the different countries which have adopted the Western political system, you very rarely see any case of a thriving country and a country well-governed country with the rule of law and the market economy and things like that. Every country has different sets of problems. That is why, for China, we are a civilizational country with 5,000-year history at least. And we have our own way of doing things. And our political system, which is what we call socialism with Chinese characteristics, has proven to be tremendously successful. How can you imagine that China has achieved sustained growth and maintained political and social stability despite of the communist rule? It is because of the rule of the Communist Party of China. So why do we need to reform things when everything is working so well? And when, a Western scholar called Francis Fukuyama,
yes,
he talked about the end of history.
1989.
Yes. That was at the victory point for the U.S.
Yes, correct.
Yes, at the Cold War. But now, if you hear Fukuyama, he's a completely different person.
The opposite, yes.
Yes. And he acknowledged so well that history has not ended with capitalism. And he's now, very much critical of the political system in the U.S. and in Western countries in terms of the gridlock that political system creates. It's not my words. It's Fukuyama's words. The gridlock and the plutocracy that has created. So I think now is the time, to open our eyes to different possibilities. We can never accept that China should follow the Western political system, because we are a proud civilization and we've been so successful. And we believe every country should be like China in a sense that they should explore their own way forward rather than following the capitalist model or the former Soviet Union's model, because China did so. China did follow the Soviet Union's model that turned out catastrophically. And so now we have decided that we will continue to adhere to the leadership of the Communist Party, and we will follow our Chinese style of socialist democracy, because that works best for China.
В началото започнах с данни за индустриалния свръхкапацитет. Западните икономисти често обвиняват Китай в този индустриален свръхкапацитет при зелените технологии, батериите, електрическите автомобили. От гледна точка на Китай обаче това по-скоро е мащабиране на производството с невероятна скорост. Къде Китай поставя границата между индустриалната ефективност, която е в рамките на закона, и пренасищането на глобалния пазар, който тревожи САЩ и Европа?
Yes. Actually, in a way, we can understand their concerns and their anxieties, but the overcapacity narrative doesn't really hold water if you look at it closely. Because, for China, our industrial capacity runs at over 74% for the large scale companies. This is roughly at the same level as the US and Europe. So you don't see that in terms of the statistics. And in terms of the products, for example, we did manufacture so many products, from solar panels, batteries, electrical cars. But if you look at it, there is a huge demand for such renewable energy products. And there is so huge demand for Chinese products in general. Yeah. If you look at electrical cars, for example, this year, 5 new electrical car brands came to Bulgaria. Yeah, on top of the 2 existing ones, the Great Wall and the Great Wall and Dongfeng Motors.
Yes,
we had these.
But I have
years.
to tell you what is scary. My father is selling his car today, and he is buying a Chinese car.
Oh, that's
today.
Great. That's great.
And many Western manufacturers, because he had a Western car, advise him not to. Like, they gave him test drives and so on. Finally, price, competitive advantage and everything. So he is buying a Chinese car. Many other peoples you've heard probably about the layouts in European autumn.
Yeah.
So this is scary for Europe in a way. And they said this is overcapacity.
That's the issue you rightly pointed out. They talk about overcapacity because they are so concerned about Chinese competition. Actually, for German cars, 80% of the German cars are for exports. But nobody talked about their overcapacity,
Okay.
Indeed, we can understand their concern. But that is because, China caught the latest trend of electrification of transport models. That is what is needed in our world. If you look at the conflict in the Middle East, if you look at the volatilities in the fossil fuel markets, and if you look at the extreme weather, recently, the heat waves, that makes the traditional gas or coal-fired power plants, even make the nuclear power plants very difficult. Yeah, but people realize, the cooling issue, no water for cooling. But if you use batteries, solar, panels, it's not too much of an issue. And people realize that they need to make the transition. Because, China developed renewable energy due to the world's international appeal for the green transition. And the EU was the loudest voice calling for green transition. And then China followed. But, whatever China do will cause waves because, we are a country of 1.4 billion.
Okay,
and we We are the top manufacturing country for 16 years in a row. So whatever we do cause some sensations. But we need to focus on the positive side. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no,
you know, all
sorry,
the
please.
German major car manufacturers are working with China to develop, their car models because it's much shorter time for them. It saves so much, human cost, and they are developing models like a smart driving. BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and are all working with Chinese manufacturers. So it is actually the picture is not that stark. It's not just like China replacing German manufacturers. It's everybody has to adjust. Everybody has to appeal to customers with their best products.
Това, което исках да кажа, вие до някъде го изтъкнете, Китай формира 29% от световното промишлено производство, Щатите 17%. Китай произвежда 13 пъти повече стомана. Корабостроенето на Китай е стотици пъти по-бързо от това на САЩ. И това са предимства на Китай пред САЩ. Но това ли са основните предимства? Защото други пък казват, че глобалните съюзи, доминацията на долара и технологичното лидерство в определени сегменти все още държат САЩ начело.
Yes, you're right, actually. We never feel China is now the number one economic power or the number one innovator. We feel, it is an interconnected world. It's economic globalization still going on, although encountering difficulties. So we feel every country has its own comparative advantage. If you look at China, our comparative advantage lies in our complete set of industries. We have every industry imaginable, in the categories. And we have a wonderful infrastructure. We have a very intensive input in research and development and in innovation. And we have a huge pool of talent to draw from. Every year 7 million young people graduate from universities as engineers, scientists, medical personnel, or agricultural experts. We have just such sheer numbers, to support. But we lag behind in many different ways. And if you look at the US is very strong in innovation, including in artificial intelligence, in semiconductor chips. And the European Union countries like Germany, Netherlands, so many countries, they are wonderful with precision manufacturing, advanced materials, and they are at a whole lot of niche products and equipment. So I think it is not a zero-sum game. Trade and investment is never a zero-sum game. Yeah, we think our countries should best work together rather than fighting any tariff wars or trade war, high-tech war. All these wars will artificially divide countries and sectors and businesses, and that's not good for anyone. Eventually everyone will lose out. Yeah.
Като говорим за едностранен победител, как Пекин вижда определение от САЩ световен ред след 1945 година, днес, като система, към която Китай вече не иска да се присъедини, или като нещо друго?
Actually, it's not a matter of joining for China because we were very much part of the whole system since the end of the Second World War. And China was a founding member of the United Nations.
Correct.
Yeah, we were the first signatory to the UN Charter. So China has been, and we became a permanent member on the UN Security Council. So actually we have been part of this international system all the time. But now there have been so much talk about China trying to upset the order or set up its own order and things like that. But if they look at what China has been talking about, they need to realize that China does feel the international order needs some reform and readjustment, because we have to deal with a whole set of new realities of our world. And the defining feature of the 21st century has been the rise of the global, so-called global South. Yeah, the so-called emerging economies. For the past 40 years, their share of global GDP has risen from 24% to 40%. And they now contribute 80% to global growth. China contributed 30% to annual global growth for more than 10 years now, which surpassed the sum total of G7 countries. But now the international order is very much dominated by Western countries, and there is a huge underrepresentation of developing countries. And this international order has shown itself to be inadequate to address the global challenges of today.
Само един въпрос. Относно наратива, казвате, че международният ред е доминиран от западните страни. Наратива за кризи в момента, като тази в Ормузския проток между Иран и САЩ, като тази между Русия и Украина, продължава ли да е доминиран от западния ред и чува ли се китайския глас?
Yes, you are right. Because, if you look at Western media for the past even few decades, especially, even including in Bulgarian media, you can sense that there has been so much misperception, misunderstanding about China, and even some outright lies spread about China. For example, our position on the Ukraine conflict has not been properly understood still, because they still see China as supporting one side at the expense of the other side. But in fact, China has taken a very fair, balanced, and just position. And President Xi, from the very beginning of the conflict, made it clear that China supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries. We support the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, and at the same time, we believe the legitimate security concerns of all countries should be accommodated, and all efforts aimed at peace should be supported. So you see China trying very hard to bring the parties together for peaceful negotiations, but this effort was not recognized or even appreciated, and you see fake news like China training Russian soldiers or China sending drones to Russia, or to any particular party. That was not true, but such lies still spread. That was very unfortunate. Yeah.
Тук ще добавя нещо, което е много интересно по повод на това, което казвате, че Китай подкрепя едната страна. Китай, например, аз сега се завръщам от Оман и говорихме за това. Китай активно разработва, инвестира и използва търговски и транспортни маршрути, които заобикалят Русия. Най-важният от тях е тъй наречения среден коридор, транскаспийския коридор. Този маршрут свързва Китай с Европа и заобикаля Русия.
Well, yes, in terms of the transport corridors, the businesses, they have the incentive to explore alternative routes because they can't put their eggs in one basket. Because we have the China-Europe connections, different transport corridors. Like in the north, because it's affected by the conflict.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, with Ukraine, and in the south, it's affected by the Middle East. So where do you go? So that actually enhances the strategic importance of Bulgaria. And China has been working very hard with countries along the middle, what you call middle corridor. Like Central Asian countries, the Caspian countries, Caucasian countries. So we are talking about making it possible for Chinese goods to flow, and that is welcomed by Bulgarian government.
Yes.
Your government is very interested in leveraging your geographical advantage, because for now, Bulgaria is not properly fulfilling its role as the gateway for Asia to Europe, because it became the last stop, because now all the goods go to Western Europe. But now, and then go through Western Europe to Bulgaria. But now, with the middle corridor, your country has the potential to become the entry point.
Many people in Oman were really amazed because they said, look, Bulgaria and Oman, we have the same number of population of people, and we are in the same geographical
right.
position, but Oman, we are using it, and you are not using it in Bulgaria.
Yes, you see?
Yes.
Yes. But of course, it requires a lot of coordination. So now we have only limited goods passing through the middle corridor to Burgas. But we need more conversations with your government, and we need more convergence of rules, like customs, clearance, inspections. And, we need more coordination, and we, of course, need more capacity building in your infrastructure, transport infrastructure. But being willing to explore such cooperation is very important, and we look forward to engaging in more detailed discussion with the Bulgarian government.
Голямо впечатление ми направи в началото. Казахте, че менталитета на Китай е друг. Не става дума за превъзходство. Данните показват обаче, че китайските корабостроителници могат да произвеждат военни кораби десетки пъти по-бързо от американските. Когато икономическото и индустриалното превъзходство стане толкова очевидно, как Китай все пак планира да избегне неизбежния военен сблъсък между установена и издигаща се сила?
Actually, we don't feel the inevitability of conflict. We don't see this. Between a so-called established power and an emerging power. That is the things that, these Western, experts, they like to talk about, including the Thucydides trap. But for China, it doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't have to be, because it really depends on the will of countries, and whether they make the right choices and how they perceive each other. Because for such conflict, misperception is normally the root cause for such conflicts. For China, although we have the growing capacity to lead the world in some area, limited areas, we do not have the intention. Because some Western theories, they only look at capacity. They don't look at the intention. They don't look at the policy direction of countries. If you listen to President Xi's speeches, you don't see him talking about anything about global domination. You don't see him talking about projecting China's military power, to interfere into other countries' conflicts. And you don't see China doing so. Like, which conflict has China engaged in the past 40 years? But our utmost concern is our national unity, especially regarding the Taiwan situation and our islands in the South China Sea. That is China's overwhelming concern areas.
За да затворим тази тема, западни анализатори все пак продължават да твърдят, че оста между Китай, Русия, Иран и Северна Корея не е идеологически съюз, а по-скоро е синдикат на прагматизма, изграден върху споделеното недоволство от Запада. Как Китай балансира отношенията си с Москва и Техеран, например, без да губи достъп до богатите пазари на Европа?
These Western commentators, they just like generating words, and very eye-catching words, but they don't explore whether their words hold true or not. Why should they put these four very different countries together? We don't see any logic in them using such horrible words like Axis. It sounds very much like the Cold War mentality. But actually, in China, we feel we need to develop relations with all the countries in the world based on mutual respect and mutual benefit. Of course, we have normal relations with all the other three countries you mentioned. At the same time, we maintain relations with the European countries, with the US. We don't see any trade-off. It's not an either-or situation. The axis is wrong to begin with. And of course, we have to have good relations with Russia, Iran, and DPRK, because Russia is our neighbor. We share 4,000 kilometer long boundary. It is the longest boundary of any two country. And we had a very complicated history of our relationship with Russia. So then we decided that our relationship will be not an alliance. It's never going to be an alliance, but it should never be confrontational, and it should never be targeted at any third country. This is the historical conclusion we have drawn from our relationship with Russia. But we don't see us, working with these countries in any geostrategic or geopolitical way in order to counter the West. We don't see things this way. It's not a black or white zero-sum game picture. We work with the West in many different ways. Like the European Union, it's our important partner. U.S. is our third largest trading partner. Why should we have to choose between the two?
Но Европа няма ли да бъде принудена да избере? Възможно ли е Европа всъщност да остане неутрален мост или натискът от Вашингтон и Пекин ще принуди да избере страна?
Well, eventually that is for the European Union, but the country which is pressing European Union to take sides is not China. China has never asked the European Union to choose sides. It is a more complicated scenario. It's not a clear-cut, alliance, a triangular relationship whereby two countries work against the third one. It's not that clear-cut. Yeah, because it's basically like a topic-based scenario, but for China, we would like to maintain good relationship with the European Union. We see China is one of the few leading countries in the world which has openly supported EU integration, and EU playing a greater role with greater autonomy, because we feel the European Union is a natural pole in the multipolar structure, global structure. We are moving in this direction. And the European Union is a key partner for China's modernization. So we have great hopes for the European Union. But this relationship is not going as well as we had hoped, for different reasons. For one thing, the European Union's perception of China is running into problems because since 2019, the European Union has started to see China as three things in one. It's partner, competitor, and a systemic rival. It's very self-contradictory and very confusing to different countries, And also the European Union tends to define its relationship with China from the prism of the Ukraine conflict. So we think that is not a fair or just way to characterize relationship with China. And the European Union, at the same time, has adopted a very protectionist approach to China on trade matters, because they fear the competition. They are so worried about their own industrial survival. But we feel, we could have worked together to make the pie bigger rather than, having to see things in a zero-sum way. And so for us, we hope to resolve the trade, disputes or frictions with the EU through dialogue. And we are making progress with dialogue. Yeah, we had the first round a couple of months ago, more than a month ago. And we have decided to resolve our trade issue by the end of October. So that is a good start, and that made us more optimistic. But eventually, the European Union has to see, the benefits of working with China, rather than having to engage in a lot of tensions and, protectionist measures. Yeah.
Аз много внимателно прочетох описанията на пълната рамка от 4 глобални инициативи на президента Си Цзинпин за развитие, сигурност, цивилизация и за управление. Светът би изглеждал различно, ако китайския модел на глобализация успее. Какво бихте казали на онези на Запад, които се страхуват все пак от въздигането на Китай?
Yes, we understand their fear and we understand their anxiety. But, it is because China is so big, And the rise of China is such a prominent phenomenon. But it's not, it's not just China. It's the whole rise of the global South. It's the changing global picture that has made so many people in the West worried. But they don't have to. Because, for China, these four important initiatives from President Xi that you kindly referred to really arise from China's worldview, because we see the world as being confronted with so many issues. Like we see so many deficits. There is the peace deficit, obviously. There are so many conflicts going on in our world. And there is the development deficit. The AI revolution is leaving so many countries behind, so many people behind. And, there is this a deficit in security and deficit of trust between countries. So that's why, he proposed these initiatives. For the Global Development Initiative, this is really to help the Global South to fulfill the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So China put up a fund in the value of $4 billion to support sustainable development goals in the Global South. And for the Security Initiative, we want to promote peaceful resolution of conflicts like Ukraine, like the Middle East, rather than having to resort to war. Because we feel security has to be cooperative security. It has to be common security. No country's security should be achieved at the cost of other countries' security. And security can only be achieved through collaboration rather than through going to war, because war creates more problems than it can ever resolve. Yeah, and for the civilization initiative, we totally reject the clash of civilization, and we see how different religions coexist in harmonious coexistence in Bulgaria, for example. And I met with your religious leaders, the patriarch, and your Muslim leaders, the Grand Mufti. We can totally engage in a dialogue and exchange, a religious exchange. We have religious delegations visiting Bulgaria. And also for the governance initiative, it is mainly to deal with the inadequacies of the international order since the Second World War, because it hasn't addressed the rising global challenges like climate change, like pandemics, and also like the AI governance. Many people are now worried about AI governance. And even like drones and the technology, they raise so many ethical and security issues for humankind. So we have to together join in discussions. So no Western country should feel threatened by these four initiatives, because they are they are based on the global interest as a whole, not try to project China's influence or not try to impose China's interests, as you can see from these initiatives. Yeah.
And finally, и последно, едно нещо, за което бихте критикували и похвалили България, днешното управление.
Thank you for raising this question. We very much appreciate the political messages made by the new Bulgarian government about better relations with China. And the Bulgarian leaders on different occasions stated that they would like to pursue more cooperation with China, including attracting more Chinese investment. And they have shown their interest in working with China to develop the educational, cultural exchanges between our countries. We are very much encouraged, because we feel China-Bulgaria relations have lagged behind China's relations in many different neighbors of Bulgaria. And that is not the desired state of affairs for our relationship. So we are very hopeful that with the new government, we can engage in some real conversations as to how we can tap into our potential cooperation to benefit the people of both countries. There are many different areas we can look at, like renewable energy, including electrical cars, and also the electrification of your public transport. It's very, very important. It can help reduce your dependency on fossil fuel. And even in the past 3 years, when Bulgaria introduced China's battery products, solar panels in large quantities, these batteries and solar energy started to account for 20% of your energy mix. So that is a wonderful picture. And we also want to explore, as you said, infrastructure cooperation through to develop the middle corridor. And there are so many agricultural cooperation to import more agricultural goods from Bulgaria to China. And there are so many different areas that we would like to explore with the new government. And the new government so far has shown interest. But we need more, we look forward to more detailed discussions with them.
Може ли само един пример за европейска страна, в която отношенията между Китай и тази страна се развиват така, както бихте очаквали с България, по-добре?
Yeah, we have many success stories with European Union countries and even with your neighbors. You know, like we had most of China's investment in Eastern Europe and in Central and Balkan areas. You know, is with Hungary. Yeah, because we have a wonderful political relationship with the previous government, and we are resuming our good relationship with the new government. You know, there are 300 Chinese companies operating in Hungary. But here in Bulgaria, we have relatively much fewer companies. And with Serbia, yeah, we have a lot of relationship with Serbia too. We have more than 100 Chinese companies. We built a lot of infrastructure projects in Serbia too. And in Croatia, for example, we have they have the bridge connecting the two parts of Croatia, is Pelisec. Yeah, bridge funded by the European Union, but contracted by a Chinese company.
And in Greece, the port.
Oh yes,
Greece.
Piraeus.
Yes.
Yes, the port. Yes, it's working very well. So you know, we have a lot of investments and infrastructure projects in different countries. But why not Bulgaria? You know, it's high time for us to bring our cooperation up to the level of our cooperation with other regional countries.
Ваше превъзходителство, Дай Цинли, посланик на Китай в България. Много се радвам, че бяхте в бюрото на Константин Вълков, наш гост тук. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.